for joining us for another Zephyr webinar. Today's topic is infusing automated testing in a manual organization. We're lucky to have a great panelist of speakers today. We have Bob Cruz, CEO from Checkpoint. Bob brings over 15 years of experience in quality assurance. He's also, Checkpoint is a partner of Zephyr, and we're really happy to have him be on this panel. Bob, can you tell me exactly why you're excited about kind of being part of this webinar?
Oh, you bet, Chris, and thank you very much for having me, and thanks to all of you for attending today. I've been involved in quality assurance and quality control for a long time. Absolutely am very passionate about software testing, and although manual testing is always going to be necessary, I just feel that with automated testing you can really improve your process. So I just love the opportunity to share with listeners just better ideas on how to implement automation. So again, thanks for having me today, Chris.
Absolutely, and we're also joined by John Sanmaz, who is an agile coach and an industry expert in both quality assurance and dev. John, why are you excited to be here today?
Thanks, Chris. I'm excited because I really have a passion for automation. Of all the things that I do, perhaps the thing that I have the most fun with, and just because you see such great, phenomenal results when you get a nice automation framework and you get automation going for a company is automation. So I'm really excited to share what I've learned from working with a lot of different companies, helping them set up automation frameworks, and hear what the other panelists have to say about it as well.
Wonderful, and finally we have Dharmveer Sidhu, who is a QA automation manager for Hyundai Auto Ever America. Dharmveer, why are you excited to be here today?
Thanks, Chris, for having me. So, Chris, I would like to say that starting my career, I studied as a developer, but moving on the ladder, I moved towards the QA processes and started introducing automation because of my development background into the testing procedures. And definitely would like to see someone having such a session for me 6 or 8 years back when I started doing automation. So I love to be here just to see if I can provoke an idea in someone's mind to put the idea that why automation is necessary and how it can actually benefit their overall productivity and processes. Looking forward to have this good session.
Thank you. And to our entire audience, this session will be recorded, and a follow-up email with the recorded webinar will be presented within the next 24 to 48 hours, so don't worry about that. Now, as we kind of talk about infusing automation in a manual organization, it's a huge topic with so many different, such a huge scope of subtopics. So today we'd like to focus on just 5 main points here. And hopefully that we can bring that value to yourself in the future. We do hope to have another follow-up webinar to cover those topics that we didn't get to today. But at least for today, we want to really cover why use automation, what to automate versus not, the top challenges that companies are facing in automation. We're lucky enough to have all of our panelists are going to describe real-world use cases in which they were part of implementing automation and what were the pros and cons that they saw throughout that process. And then finally, automation in big and small organizations. But first, we'd like to know from our audience, what do you guys use for automation? What do you specifically test? With all the different types of testing out there, everything from UI to end-to-end to UAT, what are you specifically testing? Let's take a moment to kind of have a better understanding of this from our audience. And in the meantime, Bob, what do you usually see as the main type of testing that people tend to automate as you work with multiple different companies and implementing automation in those companies?
Chris, what I see quite often is regression testing tends to score highly just because that's an area that organizations can realize a relatively rapid return on investment, because regression testing just tends to be so repetitive and often very tedious, and that's in regard to multiple environments as well.
And ironically, that's exactly what our audience agrees with. It seems that 77% of our audience is using their automation tool for regression testing. Wonderful.
Does Bob get a prize?
I was going to say, did I pass that test then?
You did, absolutely.
Good, good.
You get a recorded webinar, but anyways, so now that we have a better understanding of what people are using, automation for, why should they use automation, and what are the majority of the smaller companies that you work with automating? I'm sorry, that was to John.
Oh, sorry about that. So one of the things that a lot of organizations, especially agile organizations, encounter, and in a lot of software development shops are doing agile now, is this problem of as you build more and more functionality and iterate, you have more and more tests that you have to run. So what ends up happening is you either end up hiring this massive team of testers and test engineers to try and execute all of these tests, or you've got to start looking into automation. So I think one of the biggest factors in why to automate is because that you need regression, like Bob said, and automated regression just makes sense, right? It saves a lot of time. There's a really good cost justification there. There's a couple of non-obvious reasons also as well, which one of the reasons why I like automation so much is because it's a very well-defined spec, right? An automated test is actually usually the best spec, coming from a development background, that a developer can possibly have for a feature, because it explicitly states exactly what the feature is supposed to do. So if you have a really good automated test, you could run that test and it passes or it fails. Whereas sometimes manual testing processes are a little bit more subjective, or they don't have to be, but an automated test clearly defines exactly what is supposed to be built and whether it works or not. So that's another plus there. And with automation, it just allows QA and test engineers to operate at a higher level, right? There's always this debate in the industry, I think, about what is the role of QA and testing, and what's the future for it? And my wishes is that eventually more and more people who get into quality assurance and testing start operating at the higher level. They can think more about how to effectively test things, how to plan out tests, how to use test management systems instead of executing tests. So again, I think to speak to what Bob said about what are we automating, well, mostly it's regression, right? Mostly that's it. But there's other categories of things. Anything that we're doing manually and that we feel that we could save time or money by automating, that's a candidate for that. And that scope of that is expanding out as we get more and more tools that make automation easier. There's more and more test cases, more and more scenarios that we can automate.
Great, thank you. And now that we kind of have that understanding of why to use automation, and everyone knows that, hey, automation is, if you want to become more agile, it's definitely the way to go. But Dharmveer, as a QA automation manager, can you kind of help me understand exactly what are the top challenges around implementing automation?
So, Chris, that's a good point. I mean, the first point which can break up in my mind is the complexity of the system. So, before even starting the automation, a person or the architect or the system owner needs to understand that what the system holds for itself. What are the integration points? What are the interfaces between multiple modules? How does the system interact with external parties, external vendors? Based on that, once you have the complete understanding of the systems, then only you can participate or do the second part of the problem, which is identifying the right candidate for automation. As we discussed, so that will be the second thing, the understanding of the automation candidates. So as we already understood that regression is a prime candidate for automation, I would say there are a couple of other things which can also comes as a close candidate of having a close candidature for automation itself, something like user interface testing. Anything which is very mundane, anything which is very repetitive, which needs to be tested on multiple browsers, multiple UI platforms. This testing might be manual in the first couple of phases, but later on every team wants to do it through the automation test suites, and there are multiple tools for that. And depends upon the again, as long as you understand the system and you understand the scope of your work, you can identify the automation candidates. And then comes the third point, to have a plan for making an automation successful. So this is on the paper it doesn't look that important, but it's one of the most important procedure of spanning your automation test suite or automation test procedure, because unless and until you don't know what are you trying to achieve from your automation, what is your return of investment through automation, and what you're trying to objectify over here or cover over here in next couple of 6 months or 8 months of spending into automation, that needs to be very much clear to the stakeholders, that you will be spending X amount of hours, and then probably after 6 months you will be benefiting, maybe half of your testing efforts will be reduced, or maybe 1/3 of your testing effort will be reduced by spending X amount of hours for next 6 months. So plan has to be there to how to automate and what to automate and when to automate. So that's a definite most important challenges I can consider.
Thank you. And Bob, is there anything else you would like to add to this topic as well, of what challenges do you see that you face when you implement automation?
You bet, Chris. So, one of the big ones that I see quite commonly is when organizations are attempting to choose a framework that is right for their organization. So by framework, in choosing the framework, I include in that developing a strategy to implement that framework. So you've got to take a look at the complexity of your applications, the skill set of the individuals, the technologies and environments that you're using. Are you dealing with terminal emulator mainframe applications? Are you testing mobile applications? What might it be? And then also take a look at your testing objectives and your target dates. And then another one that I would definitely choose, Chris, would be organizations seem to struggle with utilizing the full benefits of data-driving automated test. So there was an organization once where I actually developed an automated process where manually the business analyst had been selecting a random 60 records out of 600, and it had 56 fields they were validating. And once I automated the process, and oh, by the way, it took that business analyst 18 to 24 hours per month to do that. So again, 18 to 24 hours. Once I automated the process, it did not only validate 60 records, it validated 600 records with each execution, and it did so in 15 to 20 minutes, and then the business analyst would simply spend time in analyzing the results. So if you understand the benefits and how to utilize data driving, it can truly increase the return on investment with your solution. And then the last challenge I would mention is organizations seem to struggle with developing a versatile, skillful quality assurance team with automation skills. One of the things everybody needs to remember is that first and foremost, you've got to be a good tester. There's a saying I hear people say quite often that a fool with a tool is still a fool. Another analogy I make is you can give the best carpenter in the world, or excuse me, the worst carpenter in the world, the best hammer, they're still going to be a pretty bad carpenter. So you've got to focus on training your team. Regardless of how intelligent they are, please understand that manual testing has a different strategy, a different approach than automated testing. So understand that, respect that, and give your team the training they need, not only in the automation solution that you're using, but also in automation strategies and methodologies.
Great, thank you. And now that we have that understanding of the top challenges around implementing automation, we know that as much as you would like to, you can't automate everything, right? And you shouldn't. So now it poses the question, what should you automate and what should you leave manual? Bob, I'd love to hear your insight about what you feel you should automate in an organization.
Sure. So one of the things which we've already touched upon is regression testing. Again, that tends to be repetitive. Normally you're going to do regression testing on your more critical transactions or functionality anytime you have a new release or build. Another one is load testing, And I'll include that in the third bullet as well, performance testing. You know, I remember the day, I'm older than I want to admit, but where we would get 200 testers into a room with a test coordinator saying 1, 2, 3, hit enter, in order to measure an application's performance. Well, those days are gone because there are so many great solutions out there utilizing automated testing. Another one I would say is anything that has repeated execution. And that's where data driving comes in, because perhaps you're repeating the same actions, whether it's navigation through a website or a mobile application, data entry, etc., and you're repeating those same actions over and over again, but with different sets of data. So it tends to be very repetitive. It's error prone. So great one to automate typically. And then also when working on large projects with many users, that helps eliminate the human factor. So, you know, perhaps I've been responsible for testing a specific application, and I'm going to take a vacation, head down to Key West, and I want to turn the process over to John to handle. Well, if we have automated testing involved, then that helps create more of a standardized process so that in all likelihood, John's not going to do it differently than I will.
Thank you. And actually, kind of moving forward onto that, John, can you please kind of address, you know, why we should, as we can see here, why we should leave these things as manual tests versus automating them?
Sure. So again, I'd go back to saying that, you know, this begins with a knowledge of what automation is and what the purpose is. Automated testing is not actually testing, right? It's automation of testing. And so, you know, automated testing cannot replace things that are not easily automated, and you don't gain anything, right, that you from automated testing except for having the execution speed and being able to combine parameters perhaps and have more coverage, right? So the reason why I say that is because some things are just naturally not going to lend themselves to automated testing, right? It doesn't make sense to automate things that you're only doing once, or that you don't know what the process is. If you're, you know, so again, so this, you know, if you look at this list here, things like exploratory testing, right, where you have a defined area in of how you're going to do the testing, but you don't know exactly what the script is going to be. You don't have an exact set of steps, right? You're going around and you're looking in specific areas to find things. You know, similarly related, but not the same thing, ad hoc testing, right? The same type of thing where it doesn't make sense to try and automate that. Now, some people do record an exploratory testing session so that they could play it back and reproduce a defect, but that's not really the quite the same thing, right? So those type of things, you know, we're still going to need to do exploratory testing and ad hoc testing from time to time, and so, you know, depending on how you do quality assurance in your organization, but those things aren't going to lend themselves to automation. Again, usability testing, it's the same type of thing. There's, you know, to some degree, we might be able to create automated usability tests that test for, you know, screen size, resolution, things like that. When I worked for a large printer company, we actually were able to do some pretty magical things around optical recognition of actually printed pages, but you're never going to get away from the subjective nature of usability testing, right? This is something that a machine is not good at doing. Humans are very good at judging the usability of a thing. We're never going to be able to. Maybe, I don't want to say never. Maybe when we get to that artificial intelligence point where we can create machines that can think like humans, but then we'll be automating everything, right? Because we'll just have machines doing, you know, doing all the testing. So, but until we hit that point, usability testing isn't going to make sense. The other, you know, pieces here, you know, to be less specific is, you know, the idea of when things are need to be flexible, and when you have a test case that's not going to be used that often, right? If you're going to do something once, then don't automate it. It doesn't make sense. Automation is a big investment, right? If you've ever written an automated test, even when you have a good framework, it can make things faster. But if you're only going to use it once, it's not going to make sense. It's just going to be a waste of time. That's why a lot of times regression is what we automate. And then if it's going to have to be flexible, this one is kind of a judgment call, right? Sometimes automation can give you the ultimate flexibility in the fact that you can now parameterize data sets that you couldn't do before. But in a lot of cases where the result is not an absolute pass or fail, that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about flexibility here. That's where it doesn't make sense to automate. If you can't very easily do a pass or fail, if someone's still got to check the output, then not probably a good case for automation.
Great, thank you. And now that we have that understanding of what we should automate versus leave manual, and what are some of the problems that you have when you try to implement an automation framework, I'd love to know from our audience what automation tools are you guys using? What is working for you, what is not? So we kind of take a moment to see what our audience has to say here. Dharmveer, as a QA automation manager, what tools have you used in the past? And obviously there's not one superior tool, but there are different tools for different types of project teams. So what have you utilized in the past, and what kind of success have you found with that?
Sure, Chris. So as you said, then definitely there is not a one particular tool which I can say is the best tool. It depends upon the solution which we are trying to automate. So in my experience, I have used Selenium, Robotiums, Quality Center, Load Runner, Wind Runner. So again, it depends upon the requirement of the project itself. Sometimes you need to do automation performance testing, sometimes you need to do the load testing, and sometimes you just need to do a web API testing or SOAP API testing. So there's no particular answer, but I can see the people have used more experience with the Selenium, maybe due to the web compatibility or API compatibility.
Thank you, and it seems that the majority of our audience is using Selenium, as you mentioned, and kind of further diving into that, I know that you have a great use case for us today, Dharmveer, all
Yes.
around kind of your implementing automation, an automation framework for mobile app testing. We'd love to hear more about that.
Sure, Chris. So, Chris, this was one of the my previous assignments in which we were automating the mobile application which talks to the automotive cars. So basically the car, there's a couple of applications, something like you can say a remote start or remote stop, and some similar features which were available on the app or tablets, and then with which you can actually interact with your car. So that was actually the solution which was there, and the requirement was to do a testing on all those compatible phones. So when we talk about mobile market, it's not a conventional testing model, or it's not a conventional development model either, because here you talk about the compatibility of maybe hundreds of phones with one application to talk with one solution itself, right? So if you have to bring a testing team, you probably have to bring an army of testing team, because you have so many combination of operating systems, so many combinations of OSs, so many combination of hardware, that you cannot test each and every combination for all the user interfaces or all the possible combinations of error messages, all text messages, all flash messages. So you cannot do that. But again, the market is so diverse that you have to support everyone to make sure that your client is happy, or to make sure your customer is happy with that. So having said so we try to diverge into the possibility of using automation here, and there are a lot of tools available in the market. There are multiple tools, just like PhoneMonkey, MonkeyTalk, which actually give you a single script for multiple platforms. But the question part comes, and then there are some native tools, which is something like Robotium, which gives you more access to the APIs, and you can dive into a single platform instead. In this case, actually, we go ahead and we do a hybrid approach, choosing Robotium for the Android platform, and for the iOS platform, we use the PhoneMonkey, and then we use the hybrid scripts for BlackBerry as well. So it was just such an ideal condition to do the automation, because you invested an effort of possibly 200 hours. But after that, once your application is ready, your framework is ready, your test scripts are ready, then every time when you have to do an execution, you can execute for 500 phones all together in a single button push. And the execution time is so less, and the delivery to market is so fast, the client was super happy about it. So maybe if we talk about more of in-depth things, which we have actually covered in that testing. So it might come in the next part. So basically the test actually covers the battery consumption, the network connect, the battery consumption, just to see what's the drainage power of the battery. Whenever you try to run your application, you install your application, you uninstall your application, all those possible combination. Again, this is more on hardware level. And then again, receptions, because the receptions can be very flaky depending upon the area or coverage of a particular area. So it can be edge, 3G, 4G, LTE, covering all those combinations, and then multiple screen sizes for multiple phones. As iPhone comes up with a bigger screen size, the market has definitely globalized into more bigger screen size phone now. So that was another challenge during this implementation. Another is hardware configuration for the app performance. How do app actually performs with various size of RAM, screen size, RAM availability, memory availability, just to make sure the compatibility of this. So this was in talking about the depth of the test itself. So if you see, if someone has to cover this testing in a single run itself, it might take a couple of days just to execute all those scenarios. But having your automation ready and making sure it's the best candidate, identifying it the best candidate, having the right skill set people to make it sure that it works, it makes your job much more easier, much faster, and much cheaper as well. So you are definitely paying much less for your quality. It's just the best investment you have ever made.
Thank you. And John, I know one of the things that we spoke about previously is the fact that you were brought on to a government-based company that where you were part of implementing an automation framework in order to make a team more agile. Can you kind of explain and talk to that?
Sure. So I was brought onto a project, a government project, where there was a lot of consultants working on this, and they were trying to do agile, if you can imagine, in a government environment. It's actually, I guess, not that rare, not as rare now, but when I was doing it, it was extremely rare, right? And we were trying to implement Scrum there with a very large team, probably about 90 developers and QA analysts on the team. So what ended up happening, very quickly as they were implementing Scrum, was that the developers, it was working better for the developers, right? They were starting to get some speed and getting stories done, but QA was quickly becoming a bottleneck, because what would happen is developers would implement features and they would complete the stories, and then the QA team would have to start testing all of the features at the end of that sprint or iteration. And so, at first this was okay, but as they kept on implementing more and more features, there needed to be more and more regression, right? As you implement more features, you break more things, you have to test more of the features. So this suite of regression tests was growing at an enormous pace. And so what ended up happening was the development team had to actually slow down, which is not good, right? We don't want to slow down because every time it was taking longer and longer to execute all these tests. So the solution for this was to set up automation, right? Because there was, and this is one of the key reasons why automation goes so well with Agile, right? In Agile, you have an environment where you basically are iterating and you're changing things constantly, and so regression becomes key. If you don't have adequate regression in an Agile project, you almost certainly will fail if you're moving forward, because you're going to be breaking things as you change things, and you need to know when things break. So what I did was I started creating an automation framework, and we don't have time to go into all the details here, but I do believe that if you're going to do automation, you need to create an automation framework, and there's a lot of strategy behind this. Like I said, we don't have the time to go into the details here. I'm happy to talk to someone afterwards about this, but what I did was I started building them an automation framework and pulled on some engineers, key players to help me to do this. And what we wanted to do was make a solution so that the regression tests could be executed automatically, and that we'd be able to keep up with the development. As developers were developing features, we need to have that regression suite automated. Now, a lot of people make the mistake of going in and trying to create this huge automation framework and making it do all these fancy things, and they never see any benefit from it because it never gets done, because it's, you know. And so what I really wanted to do was take the same kind of test-driven development approach that developers were taking on the team and apply it to the building of the automation framework. Right? It makes sense. So what we did was we said, okay, where's the low-hanging fruit? Where can we start? So we started by looking at, you know, the smoke tests that were being run for every single iteration. These are, you know, pretty quick tests, fairly easy to automate. They covered a large scope of the system, and by starting there, what we did is we said, okay, let's just create automation, enough of the framework to be able to automate these smoke tests. So I went in and created some of the first smoke tests. We worked backwards. I wrote the test how I wanted the test to look so that it was readable and understandable, not just by developers. And then I worked backwards from there, and I said, what kind of framework pieces do I need to get this test to execute and run? And we did that with all the smoke tests. There was probably about 10 smoke tests in overall for this, and then that became the automation suite at that point. So within week 1, right, we actually had one automated test that was part of the build that was running every time that was one of the smoke tests. So we got immediate value from that, and that literally saved hours worth of work every week. And that gave us a good framework. So what we started doing from there was, once we got all the smoke tests implemented, then I started helping the developers and the QA team work together to implement news stories first by defining the automated tests that they're going to build before they build that feature. And you know, this takes some ramping up to do, but we start off with simple requirements and said, let's have at least one automated test for each story that we're going to develop. And that automated test was built at the same time as the developers were implementing the code. So once the developers done implementing the code, we ended up having a solution, or we ended up having something that they could execute, right? So if we go on to the results here, what ended up happening was that more and more of those tests started becoming part of the regression suite. So now, instead of what was happening first, which was as developers were implementing more and more features, that the testing was taking longer. Now it was quicker every time, right? Because not only were we getting the news stories regression tests, or creating automated regression tests for them, but we were implementing some of the old ones as well, and our regression suite was growing. So we kept on moving forward, and we're actually faster. So that was really the key thing is it's sort of like that. You know, if you think about this process and where this fits in Agile, it's like you know, when you're at the beach and the waves hit you and they knock you down and you try to get back up, and then the next wave hits you. That's what was happening, right? So what we did was we figured out a way. You know, we got on a surfboard and we were able to get past the breakers, and then once we had that, we had a little bit of breathing room in order to be able to devote more time to automation, to be able to, you know, put the first things first, and to really develop a regression suite, because we stopped wasting time doing this, trying to play catch up all the time.
Thank you, John. And now that we have that kind of understanding and you know, what's it like to implement automation in an Agile framework and for mobile testing. Now, Bob, I know you've worked in the past. You worked with the financial services company on automation in regards to data loading and validation. I'd love to hear you talk more about that.
You bet. So our customer was actually Raymond James, a Fortune 500 financial firm. And they had some challenges in that, due to a recent merger and acquisition, it created applications and data, and I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of data, that needed to be consolidated into the client's systems and businesses' processes. So as you can imagine, this was going to be a very intensive level of effort. In addition to this, they had some very aggressive target dates. It had to be done within just a few short months. And they had limited resources with limited expertise in regard to automation. So our client's solution was that they brought on our team and they outsourced our team to develop an automation framework to assist with data integration testing efforts. And that team consisted of 1 lead, 4 senior engineers to design the framework, and 4 junior engineers to design repositories and test scripts in Excel. So all of these engineers had various levels of expertise in regard to automation methodologies and strategies. They had very deep expertise in implementing frameworks, and they also had expertise in the specific solution that was being used, which for this effort was Quick Test Professional. And the framework, it had a list of requirements that needed to be satisfied. So that included a script design, simple enough for a non-technical person to use, and the ability to handle regression on more than 100 different applications. So as you can imagine, this was quite an effort because it also had to work seamlessly with multiple technologies such as web, VB ActiveX, and infragistic controls. So our solution in this whole effort and the design that we implemented was we used VBScript in QuickTest Pro, and we developed a framework utilizing a keyword-driven approach based on object class and action. And the results were incredible. So in the first execution alone, Francis, we created 528 new accounts, verifying new accounts could be created with integrated data. So in other words, the data that came over as a result of the merger and acquisition. And it reduced account creation time by over 1,000%. So manually, it took approximately 22 to 23 minutes to create 1 account. And once we automated the process, that went down to 2 minutes per account. So as you can imagine, the return on investment in the man-hour saved was phenomenal. And an additional benefit was that it identified several new defects that the organization was very confident would not have been discovered had it not been for automated testing. Some other long-term benefits was that because it was such a modular framework and based on object class and actions, it was very easy to expand and cover additional applications and test cases. So it was definitely just a huge success.
Thank you, Bob. That was great. And you know, I know we're getting a lot of questions here, and unfortunately, this is the question part of our panel, and I want to thank both Bob, John, and Dharmveer for those great use cases that really covered you know, a wide range of implementing automation, not only in different organizations, but in different, you know, sectors of the industry. Those are great, and we have a lot of questions here. Unfortunately, we are running low on time, so we're only going to take 2 of them. For the rest of them, we'll confer with our panelists, and we'll make sure to get those questions followed up with within the next 48 hours here. But let's take a look at the first question here. So this question will go to you, Bob. How does a tech manager start building out a test automation team while also ensuring that existing engineers contribute to test automation within their sprint work?
Fantastic question, Francis. Thank you. So in building out a team, especially in regard to sprint, as I mentioned earlier, first and foremost, make sure that your engineers are good testers. So that saves you from having to teach them or train them about quality assurance and quality control and verification and validation, etc. In bringing on new talent, make sure that you've done a thorough evaluation of whatever automated solution you're bringing on board, or if you already have it on board, make sure that you develop a list of strong interview questions and make sure they're not simply obviously yes or no questions. The other thing I highly recommend is during an interview process, have your candidates for the position give them some hands-on, have them prove to you, have them create a simple automated script, see how long it takes them, see if they follow just, good testing practices and programming practices. In regard to your existing team, train them. I cannot emphasize that enough. There are a lot of different options out there. I can tell you our organization not only offers structured classroom training, but we also offer mentoring where we train organizations how to use a tool, testing the applications they have so that they encounter some real-world issues. But by all means, train them. Don't leave it up to your engineers to learn the solutions on their own.
Great, thank you very much. And this next question goes to you, Dharmveer. What automated tools would you recommend for automated mobile browser testing for responsive design sites?
I think it's so if you want to, there are a couple of options available in the market. I think the easiest one to guess is the Selenium. Selenium comes without a license, so actually even if you try to do a couple of POCs or proof of concept before automating, that can be an easy fetch. But another version of Selenium is Robotium. So Robotium actually talks about the mobile or the device-oriented part of the Android. So basically, it's a framework which has been supported by Google. So I would say just try to see which better needs cater to your needs. In my previous experience, I have used both of them. It depends upon the hybrid approach. Some of the functions are better used in Selenium, and some of the functions are better used in Robotium. I think these can be the easiest first.
Great, thank you. And kind of as we start to wrap things up here, one of the things that we here at Zephyr and our panelists would love to know is, how helpful did you, the audience, feel this webinar was for you? We tried to provide, the best topics and what you guys really want to learn and know more about. So please help us answer this poll, and for everyone who does answer this poll, who helps us out here, we'll provide them with a $5 gift card to Starbucks. So thank you for that. And as we kind of close things out here, I want to once again thank our wonderful panelists for providing their 10+ years of industry thought leadership. Thank you again, Bob, who's a partner of Zephyr's, and we really enjoy working with him and having him here. John Sanmaz, he's once again he is the owner and creator of Simple Programmer. This is a blog site that focuses on QA and development. It's great industry leading content. We've blogged there a couple times. You can also find him on our blog. He's guest blogged and has provided some great thought leadership for us as well. And finally, Dharmveer, obviously bringing in a QA automation manager from such a big company like Hyundai. We really appreciate you taking the time today to kind of talk to us about implementing automation in a manual organization. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Francis.
Absolutely, and thank you to everyone who stuck around here with us. And as I mentioned previously, this webinar is being recorded, so we will have it up on our YouTube channel within the next 24 to 48 hours. We'll also have a link in the follow-up email that will take you directly to this recorded webinar. For all those questions that we didn't get answered, we'll make sure to have those answered and sent those off to you. Once again, thank you for your participation, and it seems like we got a good amount of people who want their free cup of Starbucks coffee, so we'll make sure to send those out within the next day or two here as well. For everyone in North America, have a great day. For everyone who joined us from Europe, have a good evening, and thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.